Hello, my name is Monica Stefik, and I am excited to be here today to talk to you about utilizing a values-based culture to scale your organization. Here on behalf of Leverage, which we are a full-service talent and engagement company that partners with organizations all across the U.S. to help them attract and retain top talent through engagement-based practices. Let's see. Looks like my slide is taking a minute to load here. If you have any questions during our webinar today, I'd invite you to ask them in the questions box. And at the end of our webinar, I'll be making time to answer a few of those, and hopefully all of them, depending on how much time we have. And if you have questions that are unanswered that you'd like me to answer, feel free to save my email address. It's mstefik@leveragegrowth.com, and reach out to me with anything in addition that you might be wondering about. So what Leverage does when we partner with an organization is we create an actionable strategy and support that strategy through tools to maximize engagement. That creates a sustainable culture, which helps organizations attract and retain top talent. We're headquartered in Urbana, Iowa, and what's unique about us is we're owned by a parent company who we serve as the talent team for, who owns 8 different businesses that we run all out of the same headquarters location in Urbana. So we've got internal brands owned by the same company as us in e-commerce, in laundromat licensing, and in manufacturing. And then we have external partners that we're serving who are not owned by the same organization in healthcare, manufacturing, agriculture, research, and many more. So this allows us the opportunity to test and experiment with our ideas and our plans inside of our own organization before we take it out to customers. And it really forces us to require a high quality of work so that we can maintain a great culture within our own organization. At our parent company, we for many years have been recognized as a fast-growing company. We were one of Inc. magazine's 10-time winners of their fastest growing company award. And we are a company that's been recognized for many years as a top workplace, coolest place to work, best workplace in our region, in our state, and across the nation. So through that recognition, we had so many different companies for years asking us, can you help us build a great culture and one that's values-based? And we didn't have the time or the extra people in order to be able to go out to those organizations and support them the way that we wanted to. And that's how this idea of the Leverage organization was born. So I was a part of founding Leverage several years ago. And since then, we've seen some significant growth and really enjoyed supporting organizations in making themselves greater through values and through engagement practices. So in the summary of this webinar, I'd summarized a few key points we were going to touch on. And I've written these out as statements that I hope each of you can say with confidence by the end of the webinar. I want to equip you with critical elements to help you establish and align your values. I want to help you identify ways to integrate those values. I want to give you some ideas around peer-to-peer accountability. And finally, end with a discussion around what your cadence should be to drive alignment over time with those values or behavior-based expectations. One of the things that inspired me to do this webinar and to talk about values-based workplaces is because I know how uncomfortable and unpleasant it is to work in a place that's full of drama, inconsistency, or unfairness. When you think about behaviors, we all have expectations of behaviors. As an example, you can think of a manager who might hold an employee accountable for lacking respectfulness in the way that they're working. That employee might view respectfulness a little bit differently than their manager. And if there's no written definition around what the organization expects of respectfulness, oftentimes that can feel like an unfair act of accountability on behalf of the manager, which puts both the manager and the employee in an unfortunate position and creates drama in your workplace. When you define values as an organization, it depersonalizes them. It eliminates the challenges that managers run into when they say, you're acting this way and it's not okay, and an employee brings up inconsistency from one manager to another. It also eliminates uncertainty of what's really expected of employees. This helps you attract top talent and retain top talent, improve your employee experience, and make your job and the jobs of others more fulfilling. In our organization, one of the things you'll hear us say frequently is that values drive behaviors, behaviors drive results. Your real values as a person and as an organization are defined by action. Most people like what's written down in terms of values, but few act on them with consistency. So as we're talking through this webinar today, I'd like you to remember that values are not something to be achieved or checked off necessarily, but they are a discipline that is to be developed. So let's start with critical elements. Looks like I need to get my slides in order here. Let's talk about critical elements. I'd like you to walk away from this webinar equipped with a list of critical elements that help you to establish and align your core values. So the first step in doing this is creating shared meaning through consensus. What I mean is taking a group of people and having them each come together to define what they mean by, as an example, respectfulness. And defining that and redefining it until you arrive at a point of agreement around what you're talking about in action statements when you talk about respectfulness. The second is that you concisely define your expectations and you explain it through action statements. What I mean by this is that you should be like a dictionary. You should concisely define and explain the meaning in greater detail. Dictionaries have a word, they have meaning, and then things are used in context. In our organization, this looks like us defining what we call the click-stop code. You can see at the top of this sheet our click-stop code, which has think big and make it happen, promote a winning team spirit, etc. in terms of core values. And then below that, traits like courageous, communicate, strategic, and responsible, and action statements that clearly articulate what we mean when you're living out the behavior of courageous. So think about how your values drive specific behaviors, which drive specific results, and consider how you can be more like a dictionary in defining concisely and contextualizing. Next, I'd like you to think about how you can connect the requirements of your organization in terms of values to company results. What I mean by that is you should evaluate which critical outcomes are most important to your business. This could be production time, and it could be profitability, it could be call volume, or it could be something else entirely. And once you've defined those results required, back up, evaluate the code that you've defined, and connect which behaviors are most critical in achieving that result. Next, I want you to consider committing to hiring, managing, and terminating by values. I mentioned earlier that it's a process and a discipline to be a values-based organization. You want to define in your code sheet who you aspire to be, but remember that who you are as an organization is defined by your action, not by how much you like what you have written down. In other words, I'd encourage you to be engaged with your values. When we talk about being engaged at ClickStop, we're talking about commitment and aligned action to our mission, vision, values, and goals. Let me see if I can get us back on track here for our slides. So our definition of engagement is a commitment and aligned action to the mission, values, strategy, and goals. So in terms of commitment, as a critical element, you need to make sure you're committed and you're aligning those actions in terms of hiring, in terms of managing, and in terms of terminating, or those values may not be truly as important as you say they are. One thing you'll hear our CEO say frequently is that results without engagement are not dependable. In other words, commitment and aligned action is required to achieve the right results. If somebody is not committed or not aligning their action, their results could be an anomaly for a period of time, but likely aren't sustainable for the long term. In the same way, somebody could be engaged, both committed and aligned, and not achieving the results. And if they're not achieving the results, that's not sustainable for any business. So it's required in any business that people are both producing results and they're engaged in their jobs. Finally, when it comes to critical elements, we often receive these two questions, and I'd like you to evaluate what questions you might have so that I can answer them at the end of the presentation. One of the common questions we get is, what if we define things differently or disagree across different teams or between specific individuals? In terms of defining differently, keep in mind that if you find that people disagree in your consensus building or your discussion around values, that those feelings were there whether or not you talked about them. So better that you know the truth and are able to address it than not know it and be unable to address it. And remember that this practice of going about defining core values is about arriving at a right or correct definition according to your organization. So your organization is taking this information and deciding deliberately what it is that you're defining as the required behaviors from your values. So you'll want to, in advance, identify somebody who's going to own the final decision on establishing behavior statements while inviting everyone into creating that definition. That way that each person is self-proving and engaging in the topic of creating a values-driven culture. Next, oftentimes we get the question, what if we end up having to let someone go because of this new set of values or this code? And I'd remind you that as a manager, you're first responsible for setting the expectation before holding anyone accountable. So in terms of rolling out new core values or a code, I would recommend that you roll them out to the organization as a new expectation, offering everyone in your organization a clean slate in operating according to them. Since it's a new expectation, you shouldn't retroactively hold people accountable for their behavior against it. Instead, let the new expectation be a line in the sand where from that point forward, you begin to hold people to a new expectation. Also know that accountability is one of the most critical pieces of making your values successful over time. Let's move on to the next point. I have one question here from an individual who asked about receiving a copy of the presentation, and just know I'd be happy to share this following the presentation. So in terms of steps to integrate, I want you to be able to walk away from this presentation and be able to make the statement with confidence. I know what steps I can take to integrate these values as an expectation in my organization. So the first step of all is to share your vision. Make sure people understand the why behind why you're approaching this this project of establishing values the way that you are. Help your team know that you're embarking on this journey and that it takes everyone's alignment in order to get there. In our organization, we often talk about what we call the formula. The formula is a method of delegation in order to invite others to take ownership alongside of you. You want to make sure in sharing your vision that you share the what's in it for me and answer for employees how this might impact their careers. Then answer how it might impact company results. And if it's done with excellence, what could be help people see a vision for a better work experience as a result of defining core values and a code. Remember that sharing vision isn't about making a promise, it's about inspiring hope and commitment from others. You may want to consider how to get people to sell themselves on the idea of core values and buy into this vision by asking them how having a great culture could improve their career and the results of their team. I mentioned this a moment ago, but this is our formula for effective delegation. It's 4 parts, pretty easy to remember. Share a clear vision, set clear and high expectations, allow autonomy, and then support and hold people accountable. And I'd like to point out, when you look at autonomy, people often think of autonomy as freedom. And the root of the word autonomy is not freedom, but self-governance. And you have to remember that in order to self-govern, you have to have something to govern against. So in order for somebody to work autonomously, it is required that they have a clear and high expectation. The next element in integrating values into your workplace is to make sure you're aligning and defining them together. This happens through thorough listening. And oftentimes what we recommend is that you send out a survey to your entire organization and ask them questions like, what behaviors or character traits are most important to you in your coworkers? What defines a great culture? What traits do you admire most in a great teammate? And what behaviors do you expect on a top performing team? Asking questions like this will draw out the most important behaviors in your organization to shape your workplace into the kind of place that will be thriving and values-based. Once you've completed that survey, I'd recommend categorizing the results and compiling them, then hosting a number of focus groups to discuss them further. Help people compare and contrast what they mean, offering plenty of time to listen, define, and redefine explanations. Then you should move to identify an owner that can recap all of that information and share a concise recap of what has been shared so that you can define a code. Next, once you've defined your code, what you want to do is provide access to it. In our organization, this looks like us looking around and saying, how can we provide access to the most important information from where people work? We've got people in manufacturing, in our warehouse shipping product. We've got internet marketers and a sales floor where people are on the phones constantly. And for us, common places we know everyone goes are bathroom stalls. So we post this type of information and announcement inside of bathroom stalls on our company intranet. We send it out through email. We might put it at the front desk, hang it in cubes, or put it up in large signage inside of our manufacturing space. Remember that access is important, but access both physically and electronically in a convenient way for all employees. Next, think about how you can use recognition as a way to integrate these values into your workplace. The formula for great recognition is making it timely, making it specific, and making it personalized. In our organization, this looks like us soliciting input from employees on what's great about their teammates, and then sharing that during an awards ceremony every quarter, and presenting stories around what somebody did to live out values in order to achieve a specific result. We also cover this at times during team meetings by starting or ending the meeting with kudos, or by providing recognition cards that are either electronic or printed and easily accessible for employees to hand out and recognize each other. Lastly, I want you to think about how you can use accountability as a method to integrate core values into your workplace. And remember that if a values-based culture is more of a discipline than an achievement, then integration looks like it becoming a part of your normal schedule. You want to provide employees a tool to frequently self-assess themselves against the values and the behavior statements that you've written, and then incorporate it into performance reviews. Identify which critical values you might need to focus on as an organization or as individuals to achieve key goals inside departments or organization-wide, and in order to execute on whatever the defined strategy is. Remember that performance for anyone inside your organization is a combination of their alignment with your values and the results that they achieve. This creates consistency and sustainability for the long term. The next item I wanted to touch on during this webinar is peer accountability. I wanted to equip you with a few ideas that will help you inspire peer accountability across your organization. Just as we talked about earlier, casting a clear vision is extremely important in integrating your values into your workplace. And it's also very important in terms of inspiring peer accountability. If your values are something that are exclusively driven forward by your senior leaders or by only certain managers, they will likely fall flat because your culture will never be what you say it is. It will always be dictated by the actions taken. So take the opportunity as you're rolling out your values to invite all your employees into taking on added responsibility in owning what it is to live out these values. Help people remember how they can manage themselves according to these values and focus first on their individual performance before worrying about anyone else's. Next, once you have that code sheet, bring your teams together and have them all in one assess how they're doing as a team in performing according to those key behaviors and key values. Have them during that discussion contrast what might be awkward or difficult to address with a peer or with a teammate. And then also help the team to anticipate and have a vision for what doing these things well might cause for their individual careers and for their team. Two common questions we get around peer accountability are, what if somebody holds a peer accountable for something that they shouldn't? And what if the team won't participate in peer accountability? And if you run into the first situation where somebody is holding another individual accountable for something that they shouldn't, I'd encourage you first just to slow down and listen. Many things are just misunderstood, and asking some questions and doing some thorough listening might go a long way and may make you discover more is going on than what you originally thought. So after you've listened thoroughly to what's going on, remember that the purpose of defining and putting together objective statements around core behaviors and values is that they're no longer personal and they're less subjective for the organization. So in a situation like this, you need to bring together both the employee and the person that was held accountable for something that they shouldn't have been, and remind them kindly of what the expectation is and why the situation doesn't necessarily align with the accountability that was provided. Do that in as empathetic and as caring a way as you can, and know that it's your responsibility as a leader to lead those two individuals through it. Second question is, what if my team won't participate in peer accountability? I'd like you to think about why this might occur on a team. And what I have noticed most frequently when managers are struggling to get their team to hold each other accountable is that oftentimes the manager is allowing the team to delegate accountability conversations to them on a consistent basis. Meaning that Joe walks into Susan's office, and Susan is the manager, and says, I'm having a problem with so-and-so. They missed the expectation here. Will you hold them accountable? And then the manager is taking ownership of that and going and acting on it. Where what I would recommend is that a manager, in most all situations, not necessarily every situation, but in most situations, when you have an employee come into your office and say that they need you to solve an accountability issue based on something that they're observing, talk the issue through with them and equip them to have the conversation. Then give them a deadline for when they need to deliver the conversation by, and ask them to send an email recap to the person they're delivering the conversation to. Once they've sent that email, have it forwarded to you so you know the conversation happened and you know the quality of the communication. If that doesn't occur, oftentimes I'll bring both parties into my office and we'll have a discussion around what was shared and why, making sure that we remain respectful while courageously offering accountability to one another. One thing that an author who I admire very much stated in her book, No Drama Leadership, this is Marlene Chisholm, she said, lack of accountability exists only because it's allowed to exist. I think that is a worthy quote for all of us to evaluate in all aspects of how we work. The last section of this webinar is on the cadence to maintain alignment with your values over time. So I want you to walk away and have a clear idea of how you can drive alignment, not just initially in your values, but for the long term. As I said at the beginning, values drive behaviors and behaviors drive results. Inside of our organization, we recommend revisiting our vision for our culture and our values and the expectations very frequently. That means at least monthly. Readily recognize the people around you and make sure employees and managers feel responsible for recognizing one another. It's not one way, it's always. And then lastly, remember how critical accountability is in driving alignment. I believe it was Peter Drucker who said, what gets measured gets managed, and that could not be more true than when it comes to core values. Inside of our organization, these are the most common ways that we ensure alignment with our values. In our employee review process, we always start with employees providing a reflection on their own performance first, then sharing that with their managers, and then collectively having a discussion around it. And what I would recommend is that you incorporate your code behaviors and your values, those action statements you've written around values, into your employee review process at least twice per year. Include that in how you evaluate compensation and how you evaluate performance. Next, one thing that we do is we host regular town hall meetings. In front of the whole organization, we recognize people who have met a performance goal and which key behaviors led to that result being achieved in front of the whole organization. Coming back to the example of the dictionary, think of your town hall meeting and telling stories about achieved values as the context of, or the examples of that word being used in action. This is how you demonstrate for people what it actually looks like in your company. The last item I have on this list is around missed expectations. And one thing you should do is train your managers that when they have a missed expectation they need to hold someone accountable for, that they first ask questions around it, and then they connect the result that was not achieved to missing behaviors in your code. And if they can do that well, you'll find a way to use your code and your behavior statements as a tool for development. Inside of our company, this is one way I have laid out our cadence. You can see I've got channel, frequency, the owner of the communication, and then a summary of what the communication is. So this is true to our organization. We've got an intranet that we're posting at least 3 times a month on. Our director of communications is responsible for it. And in that communication, we're interviewing employees to tell stories about how they achieved specific results of their job through the behaviors that exist in our code. Next, I already talked a little bit about our town hall meetings. This is something run by our senior leadership team. Next, we have got performance reviews and compensation that happen 2 to 3 times a year and are run by direct managers. And we've got an assessment of behavior-based actions and results in every one of those performance reviews. We post on social media about how our employees are living out these behaviors and achieving great results through them. And lastly, we have a regular employee survey that we administrate to the organization to help people identify how they're doing in terms of key drivers of engagement and engagement in our values. 2 common questions we get around cadence is, how will I know when my efforts are successful, and how long do we need to include values in our cadence? So first, I think you can determine when you're successful based on when it's no longer clunky or awkward to talk about these values and behavior statements. Without a doubt, the first time that you define them and the first few months and maybe even the first year you use them, it's going to feel a little bit formalized and awkward to include them in your conversations. You can also know that you've been successful when you start to hear people talk about them regularly and people see value in the emphasis you're putting on behaviors. Lastly, you'll see values become a part of your organization. They'll become a part of your daily and weekly disciplines and truly be integrated into what you're doing and not something extra. In terms of how long you should expect to include values in your cadence as an organization, I would expect that you would do this indefinitely. Now, you'll want to monitor what your cadence looks like and probably expect to change your channels and what exactly you're communicating, but communicating about values will be forever important as long as values are important. Remember that being a values-based organization is a discipline more than it's something that's achieved or accomplished with an endpoint. So I've covered all 4 of the points that I had hoped to today, and it looks like I have a few questions coming in. Looks like I have one question that says, are you able to share a sample survey? The answer is yes. I'd be more than happy to share a sample survey. You can email me directly at mstefik@leveragegrowth.com. It's at the bottom of the slide that's currently live on your screen. Please let me know and I'd be happy to share it with you. Another question coming in is, how do you integrate with performance management processes and systems? And what we've done inside of our organization is the attributes that employees are evaluated against, we've just added the core behaviors in our organization and asked managers to rate employees' performance and provide context around what they mean with their rating. The same way that you would evaluate a sales rep on their sales volume, you would evaluate an employee on their courageousness. I hope that helps. Another question is, who is to say the definitions are legally binding? I'm not sure I fully understand the question or the reasoning or the thought behind the question, but part of the purpose of going about defining core values from an organizational standpoint is to make sure that there's a common language and a common definition that your organization is holding to. Now, does that mean they are legally binding or not legally binding? I'm not certain I know the answer to that, but if you can email me, I'd be happy to have a further discussion around it. Again, my email is at the bottom of the current slide. Well, I appreciate each one of you and the time that you spent on this webinar today. I hope you found it valuable. And if you'd like to learn more or take the next step in terms of establishing a values-based culture and shaping your employee experience into something more, I'd encourage you to go out to our website and download our tool that helps you assess your employee experience and better understand what behavioral expectations exist where you work. I thank you for your time today, and I hope you'll reach out and let me know some of your takeaways and email me your questions directly. I appreciate your time, and I hope you all have a great day.